Let's start. Since our two guests are on East Coast time and have graciously, kept themselves caffeined and napped, I guess, so they can stay awake with us, I think we will start. So welcome to our program. We're so happy that all of you are interested in this significant topic and joining us this evening for a discussion about the end of Roe, what comes next. For those of you who may not be familiar, I would just like to give a quick introduction to National Council of Jewish Women. Is a grassroots organization that focuses on social justice advocacy to protect rights and improve the lives of women, children, and families. And we do so within the framework of reproductive justice. So we are on the front lines battling for access to reproductive health care. We, in fact, as many of you know, are co-plaintiffs in a lawsuit against the state of Arizona because of last year's reason ban, which prohibited terminating a pregnancy for the reason of fetal genetic anomalies. And this year, we were very active, of course, in trying to prevent the 15-week abortion ban that nevertheless was signed into law. We also were on the front lines lobbying to prohibit, but unsuccessfully, bills from passing that would restrict LGBTQ rights, prohibit transgender medical care, also bills that ban books and limit what teachers may teach in the classroom. So this was a very difficult session, but not a surprise. It's all part of the larger picture and the larger restrictive strategies that state legislatures and Republican-led states are applying. This topic is one that we have addressed, certainly access to reproductive health care, for years. And we're going to explore the next stage of it. But to set the tone, I would like to show just a very brief trailer from a film that I did that was released back in 2017 and that was completed in 2016, which certainly sets the tone and prophesized where we are today. Sydney?
It is a very scary time in the United States right now for a woman to become pregnant.
Every aspect is now being subject to state punishment, control, and surveillance.
There's 3 officers. They wanted to know if I had an unlawful miscarriage.
He's getting out the handcuffs. You have a warrant for your arrest.
She was still bleeding from having the baby.
We have to say that life begins at conception.
Who speaks for the baby?
We've been passing laws in state after state, and they think they're going to waltz in and just repeal them? It's not going to happen.
The anti-choice movements, they have moved into positions of power.
We did not see the onslaught that was coming.
The last time this country dealt with an issue of this dynamic, we shot each other to doll rags on the Civil War battlefield.
A law had passed. It would be illegal to induce my pregnancy.
I could have lost my love of my life. It was 10 days of torture.
She didn't sign anything. What's going on here? How can they just be rolling her down the hallway into the operating room?
The state has the right to intervene in a woman's life from the second she becomes pregnant. That's an intrusion in the life of an individual that should shock every true conservative in this country.
2 to 3 women will die every day in the United States from pregnancy-related complications.
In some states, it's safer for a woman to go and give birth in a developing country.
I didn't want to have any more children. I had asked my doctor, can we go ahead and get my tubes tied? I was told no.
There's a lot of people who just simply have no idea how horrific it has been.
If we don't step in, all of these dominoes are going to come down together.
And so the dominoes have come down together. We certainly were not prescient when we put that film together. We connected the dots. We saw what was on the horizon. We saw the rumblings across the country. And now, it is not a sudden eruption. The opposition was very strategic. They plotted very carefully. They paved the way for generations, literally, from their youth camps to training people to run for local school boards, state legislatures, and then Congress. And they finally kept their eye on the prize with Donald Trump and the Supreme Court candidates that he got confirmed. So here we are today with countries like Chile and Mexico and Kenya and South Korea legalizing abortion. And we have state after state after state restricting access to health care. From Arizona, which you all know just did the 15-week ban, and has a ban on the books that could go into effect if Roe is overturned. And then Florida, as you saw, Oklahoma, Missouri, that not only was banning abortion, but was following Texas in criminalizing anybody who would assist with an abortion or help transport somebody. So what we look at now are states that not only are restricting healthcare, but criminalizing pregnancy. We saw what happened in Texas recently when a woman who was self-induced went to an emergency room when she was bleeding and was arrested and allegedly charged with homicide. Yes, the charges were dropped, but the criminalization of pregnancy has been occurring across this country for years. And we can only envision what is going to happen next. Everybody is quick to say, well, there's medication abortion. But a number of states, like Arizona, prohibit obtaining medication over the counter without doctor prescriptions, and certainly ban it from telemedicine. And then since January, legislators in 20 states have proposed bills that would restrict or ban access to abortion pills, which were approved more than 2 decades ago by the US Food and Drug Administration. So we're going to explore tonight what's next. And we're very fortunate to have with us 2 people who have been addressing the issue legally and investigatively for years, and now on the front lines. We are very lucky to have Jessica Sklarski, who is a staff attorney with the Center for Reproductive Rights and happens to be our attorney in our lawsuit. And we have Robin Marty, former journalist, author of the book Handbook for Surviving Roe, Handbook for Survival in Post-Roe America. And she also now is the director or manager of an abortion clinic in Alabama. So I welcome both of you. And I'd like to start, Jessica. Where do we go from here? are there legal options? What happens to all of the bans that are on hold because of injunctions around the country, all of the pre-Roe prohibitions? Is it just open season? Should the Supreme Court overturn Roe, or at least diminish it to such a point that everything falls back to the states and it is decided that it is not a constitutional right? And along those lines, I'd like to ask you, because I question if it is not protected by the 14th Amendment as a constitutional right to privacy, then we've discussed this. What happens to the Griswold case, 1965, which allowed access for married couples contraception? What happens to gay marriage? What happens even, as we saw some absurdly and yet dangerous comments from a senator in Indiana, what happens to Loving versus Virginia about interracial marriage? All of these rights are grounded in the 14th Amendment. So, Jessica.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. So I'll try and take a few things in turn. Certainly, the right to an abortion is intertwined with all of the other privacy rights. So if you think about the right to contraception, the right to choose how you raise your family, the right to choose who you marry, all of those rights are intertwined. And so I do think it's important to note that sort of Roe falling undermines all of those rights. And so it is, I think, unwise to think that it stops at abortion. It should maybe the sort of the first thing to fall, but I do think that the anti-movement is sort of going after all of those rights eventually. So it is a scary, a scary prospect and a scary future. In terms of what happens next, I do think we really have to wait and see a little bit. We're waiting on the Mississippi case. I'm not sure if everybody has heard of it, so I'll give a little bit of a background on it. But currently before the Supreme Court is a case, Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health Organization. And that case challenges a 15-week abortion ban from Mississippi. And it squarely puts before the court the question of whether or not to uphold Roe v. Wade, which set the legal precedent that says states cannot ban abortion prior to viability. And Mississippi has explicitly asked the Supreme Court to overturn Roe, to uphold their 15-week ban, and to allow states to ban abortion completely. Now, despite Mississippi making those asks, the court could still come out a few ways. They could directly overturn Roe and uphold the 15-week ban. Apologies, it's very late at night, but my lights in my office are always going off. And if they explicitly overturn Roe, then I think, sort of the very grim picture that you've painted, Sylvia, is likely. There are a lot of states, and I can put up a slide in a little bit that sort of shows what that could look like. But there's also a scenario where, they uphold the 15-week ban, but they don't say that Roe is overturned. And maybe that implies that there is a new bright line rule at 15 weeks. Or maybe it's a vague standard under which, there is a right to an abortion, but it's not exactly clear when states are going to be permitted to ban abortion. And in that scenario, well, certainly not a good outcome. There are going to be, there will be lawsuits that continue to try and prevent states from banning it completely and to sort of try and hold the line as much as possible. But if we go back to that first scenario where Roe is overturned, I think sort of the battleground is really going to change and shift. It is still going to be a battle, but the focus is going to shift. So focuses will be on, in some states, focusing on state courts and state constitutions that may or may not have independent protections for abortion access. So some of the states that have independent constitutional rights to abortion are states you would expect, like California. But there are other states that you maybe wouldn't expect, like Kansas. And I think there are some other states who haven't explicitly come out one way or the other, like Oklahoma, where there could actually be found by the Oklahoma Supreme Court independent right to abortion under their state constitution. And so the battleground will shift possibly for some time out of federal court into state courts, and then into state policy initiatives, grassroots movements on the ground. I think trying to change the legislation, turn the legislators in some states, and so those are some of the issues. Then I think even at the federal level, there will be some opportunity for federal legislation to sort of change what's happening. One piece of legislation that was voted on actually for the first time this year was the Women's Health Protection Act, which is a federal bill that would codify basically the right to an abortion. It would allow us to challenge all of the unnecessary restrictions that sort of were the prophecy that sort of forebode what was coming in the future in terms of all of the bans, and it would allow us to challenge the bans and get rid of them and to protect access in the states. There are also federal legislation that's been considered, the Each Woman Act, which would reverse Hyde. Hyde is an amendment that's prevented federal funding for abortion care in basically almost all instances, and rolling that back would just expand access to so many populations. And so I guess, while it's a really grim future, and I don't want to paint a rosy picture, there are going to be means to sort of continue the fight and reasons for us to still hope that there are ways we could turn it around.
So I'm kind of a Debbie Downer because that's what I do, is plan for worst case scenarios and then hope that somehow we can avoid them. And while everything that Jessica is saying is amazing and gives me hope, it also reminds me that when we say federal landscape and we say the country and we look at all of these things, in general, that is going to completely miss the South. We talk about abortion access post-Roe as being this patchwork of access where you may have to travel one or more states in order to get to an abortion clinic. And while that is true for the most part, what people don't recognize is when we talk about the states that do have constitutional measures that say that there will be no abortion, they are all together in the South. They're all piled up next to each other in the Gulf Coast. And so while there are ways that federal legislation can come in and help, or that we can try to fight things in state courts, when you're looking at Texas over to Florida, Florida is the only place that has a constitutional protection that allows clinics to stay open. And that is hanging by a thread because there is the possibility that their state Supreme Court will take that down if they see a challenge. So what I do is I work to try to make sure that there is access in some sort of way that goes across the Gulf, because while I believe that the Hyde Amendment should be gone, very much so, the reality is that the same states that are banning abortion in that area also have never expanded Medicaid. And so our patients that we see have no insurance whatsoever, because even being able to get onto Medicaid means you have to make less than $21,000 a year as a single person. Having abortion, even if Hyde was brought down, private insurance can't cover abortions in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. So we're talking about an entire area that a person needs to travel 12, 15, 20 hours by car in order to get out of the area into a safe state where they'll be able to access care. And so while I feel like the next step obviously is we need to find a way to get federal rights back. We need to find a way to make this blow less. I also recognize that the South has already figured out how to opt out of anything federal. If they didn't have that ability, we would have expanded Medicaid. Is there going to be some other thing that they'd be able to wiggle their way out of federal legislation? I'm sure they'll figure it out, because that's just what they do, because they don't want to be a part of the social fabric. So while we are spending time looking at what will we do to try to gain back rights in the states and to try to keep and regain rights in the country, we also need to recognize that in these states, there is going to be too many roadblocks and too many places that people are going to be stopped from being able to get out of a state to get care. And I know that we've talked about self-managed abortion, and that's an important part of it. But what we are not recognizing is that medication abortion is only one aspect of what is going to be necessary in order to protect vulnerable populations. Medication abortion is never going to be a panacea in any way if we do not have safe spaces for people who are trying to manage their own abortions to be able to go into in order to access medical care. Every person who has had an issue and has been arrested over trying to manage their own miscarriage has been turned in by a medical system, be it the nurse that they saw, the doctor they saw, somebody like that. We need to find a way, especially in states that will not be able to access abortion, that we can keep places open that will be able to be places where a patient who is worried about their bleeding or is not positive if they've been able to properly do their abortion, or just people who are having bleeding from a wanted pregnancy and are afraid that they will be accused of having tried to do their own abortion, because it will affect everyone as soon as everything is banned and illegal.
And we have seen cases like that over the years, many of them in Alabama, where
yes, which is why this is really important to me.
Right, where women who were miscarrying showed up at medical facilities, were reported and arrested, and that has happened across the country. I also would like to point out that yes, the South has been determined. I mean, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, but let's not forget, Texas, Arizona, Idaho are also states with incredibly stringent laws.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting, Jessica, because you bring up WIPA, the Women's Health Protection Act. Of course, we know that the Senate did not, it passed the House, of course, and died in the Senate. And given the ominous predictions for what might happen in November, it makes us very guarded that WIPA and the EACH Act will offer the respite that's needed. So you said a grassroots effort is needed on a state level, certainly, to begin to moderate some of the stringency of these bills. I would raise the question, where has everybody been? I look at some of the people who are in attendance here. Where are the young people? And I have been saying that ever since the film came out and I went on nationwide tour. Interestingly, a friend just emailed today that she had been with a niece and asked her niece, where was the outrage over restrictions and reproductive health care? And her niece said, people aren't going to take to the streets. They only care about bread and butter issues. And my friend pointed out, but this is an economic issue. And I think that one of the tasks we may have to do, which we are trying to do here in Arizona, is point out that the restrictions cost state economies $105 billion a year in reduced labor force participation, lost wages, therefore lost spending. But how do we galvanize support here? How do we get people to put the pressure on the states, other than at the polls, of course, in November? Either of you. I mean, what are your thoughts? How do we mobilize? Because the opposition has been mobilizing for 50 years.
I think part of the problem that we have on our side, and I hate to say this, is the fact that it's a lot easier to mobilize when A, you have a built-in network that comes from churches, and B, you have endless money that comes from churches. The amount of money that goes into the various facets of the pro-life movement from different churches and the way that it is tithed back into people in order to start their own ministries. And I say this with the idea that, I mean, every crisis pregnancy center that's located next to my clinic, all of these things are all sponsored by and brought together by churches. Our clinic is ridiculously protested by one particular church. A new set of people are coming in from another church. Everything on every level for them is organized on churches, which is why it makes sense that the end game isn't, oh, let's end abortion. It's let's put things back into this idea of biblical Christianity, and those are the laws that we should be following, because that's who's supplying the money for it. The issue isn't necessarily why aren't we in the streets? It's why have we not figured out how to move the streets into action? Because we've had our big marches, we've done these sort of things. There are lists that are up the wazoo of people who want to get involved, who want to do action, but somehow this is not translating into actual change and actual movement. And I think part of the problem is the fact that our movement has always assumed that there's a scarcity of resources. And so we always have to fight against each other in order to try to find the funding to accomplish the things. And again, this goes back to the other side is not fighting in the same way because they seem to have this endless flow of money that comes to them through churches and tax exempt status and all of that. We need to figure out how to turn people into action, and that action has to be, it doesn't do any good to come out to the streets in a march if you just go right back home and do nothing.
I want to maybe offer one other thing to one other facet, I guess, to this particular aspect of the conversation. If you look in all of these, states of the South, Arizona, sort of across the board, and we think about sort of what's happened to the state legislatures there, like it also is tied into voter suppression and gerrymandering in these states. So if you look at the sort of numbers about how people feel about reproductive autonomy and whether or not Roe should be overturned, the vast majority of people in this country, support Roe and support the idea of reproductive autonomy. And so what's actually going on in these legislatures is, contrary to sort of what you would think the Democratic outcome would be. And so I think maybe it's also just thinking bigger. It's not, maybe this issue isn't what motivates people, but we do need to focus on voter suppression. We need to focus on undoing gerrymandering, because and so the democratic outcomes that one would, expect is really what happens. So like, just one example of this would be, Texas SB 8, which was sort of the vigilante law that's now been in effect in Texas for more than 7 months with disastrous outcomes. That law was not popular when it was considered, and according to polling, it's still not popular. People in that state don't want it to be in effect, but because of the gerrymandering that's gone on in that state, it is. And so I think another big question is sort of what are, is voting rights? Like, how do we fix sort of those bigger issues on the ground so that democracy is actually allowed to function?
100% what Jessica said. And also it leads to one of my feelings that I am vaguely optimistic about what the decision will be in the summer. And I'm only vaguely optimistic about it because I do not believe that they can get rid of Roe at this moment because they need it in order to bring people out to vote. When we hit a point where abortion is completely gone, then they will no longer have that easy cudgel in order to get people to come out, all of the single issue voters that they are able to woo over into elections and into voting for against their own self-interest, because all they care about is abortion. And so as you watch how voter suppression is happening, how gerrymandering is happening, but also how all of these new laws that have come about all are creating felonies. It's a felony to help somebody access an abortion. It will be, you could end up in jail if you try to get an abortion. These are all things that while you can eventually pay your fine and get out of jail, etc., you will lose your right to vote. And so they're specifically targeted against a class that is going to be the most likely to vote Democrat. And that's being done on purpose. And so reproductive legislation, anti-reproductive legislation, is in fact another form of voter suppression.
Well, there's no question about that there is an intersectionality with all of that. But where do we go from here? Is it, I mean, certainly it's going to fall down on the states. There's seems to be little doubt that the Supreme Court is going to let this and perhaps other rights be part of, state laws. If that's the case, is it likely that there will still remain a 6-week window, an 8-week window? Or do you think that many of the states will go the route of moving that line down to a complete ban like Oklahoma?
I mean, we're already at a complete ban. So we're just waiting. Ours is enjoined, and we have been told that if the Supreme Court says that Roe is overturned and states can do whatever they want, what we've been told is actually that we have a pre-Roe ban that I didn't know about, but I should have assumed, that actually makes it not only illegal to provide an abortion, but to obtain an abortion. And that will go into immediate effect, is how it is written. That will be right back in effect until the point in which the anti-abortion activists would go ask the judge to take the injunction off of our ban, and then at least the person who is obtaining the abortion will no longer go to jail, because that's the good ban, where you don't go to jail if you have an abortion, just everybody else does. So yeah, where I will be honest that I've been beaten to the point where if they say you can have abortion until 15 weeks, I will be thank you so much, because I'm scared.
One thing I would suggest if people are actually, so it is going to depend state by state, and I think a lot of states are going to go as far as they think, as far as they can, they're allowed. But the center did create a helpful tool. What if Roe fell? I believe it is what it's called. And it's sort of a picture of the United States, and it has classified each of the states into various categories about showing sort of which states have protected access, which states, have either like a state law or a constitutional or abortion access is protection in the Constitution. And then it goes through the states and shows also which states have trigger bans, which states have pre-Roe bans, which states have, pre-viability injunctions. And so it really sort of helps to sort of map out kind of the day Roe is overturned, what is the landscape in each of these states and what is it going to look like?
Do you want to share that?
I just put it in. Oh,
yeah, I can share the map. I have it in my presentation. If you want, I can try and put it up. 1 second. I'll go through those 2 slides briefly. Share screen. I'm not good at this, so bear with me. Okay. 2 slides. Can folks see this now?
Yes.
Okay, so you'll see, so this is a map that's sort of pulled from this digital tool, which is available at the URL in the bottom right-hand corner. But you'll see there are the sort of purplish blue states and the yellow states, and those are the states that either have a state law or a state constitution that protects access to abortion. So in all of those states, we would anticipate that no matter what happens in the Jackson Women's Health case, they will still have legal access to abortion. In sort of the paler red states, they're not protected. And then in the deeper red states, those are states that are hostile to abortion care. And so those are states where we expect access to be limited after Roe is overturned. And if we go to the next slide, you can see all of the different bans that are currently in existence, I'll say, across the states. So the blue X's are trigger bans. So you'll see, for example, Tennessee has a trigger ban on the books. And that trigger ban is written such that if Roe is overturned in whole or in part, that abortion will become illegal in the state within 30 days of the decision, or 30 days after the decision is issued, basically. And a lot of states have laws akin to that. And so as soon as Roe v. Wade is overturned, abortion is basically automatically going to be made illegal to whatever extent the law specifies. The states that have yellow X's, those have pre-Roe bans. So these were bans that were on the books before Roe was decided, outlawing abortion. And those laws have either just been totally unenforceable because of Roe, or they're actually specifically enjoined by a court. And so those are laws that could sort of spring back into effect in various ways if Roe is overturned. And then the states with the white X's have pre-viability gestational bans that are currently enjoined by court orders. But again, those injunctions could theoretically be lifted if the states took actions if Roe is overturned. So it kind of just, you can look at Arizona as an example. Arizona is obviously hostile to abortion. The state does not have a trigger ban, but they do have a pre-viability criminal ban, as you mentioned, Sivia, earlier. And there's also a 20-week ban that's currently enjoined, and soon there will also be, in effect, a 15-week ban that has not been challenged yet because it's not in effect. But that is sort of the, it provides a little bit of a picture, of what could theoretically happen. And even though Oklahoma, did pass this sort of total ban, it is going to be challenged in state court. And I think there is, some hope that there will be, that the Oklahoma Supreme Court will prevent that law from going into effect and may find a right to an abortion independently under that state constitution. So that's one perhaps glimmer of hope.
So as bleak as the picture is here, let's talk about what comes next. What do we do now that access, surely it is limited and it is going to be even more so? How do we survive this? What is the aftermath? Obviously, there are going to have to be the new undergrounds, as there were the Jane Underground, etc. There are, we all know, travel networks now that have been going on for the past 5-6 years to transport people from one state to the next, particularly for later terminations. Will there be more of them? We know there's a problem with medication because states, as we said earlier, some states ban them, some states prevent you from using them on your own, from self-inducing. So, and in a number of states, those carry criminal charges, like the one woman that was in the film trailer, Jenny McCormick. That happened to her in 2012 in Idaho, because Idaho had a law on the books that pregnancies could only be terminated by a doctor in a medical facility. So let me ask you, Robin, you wrote the handbook for survival in post-Roe America. Where do we go? What do we begin doing?
So I always tell people that the best things to be doing at this moment are, first of all, to make a plan for yourself if you are a person who is capable of becoming pregnant or or taking care of somebody who is capable of becoming pregnant, that you need to figure out and start planning for if you should ever need an abortion. So learning the landscape of how far away your clinic will be if something ends up happening, what you are allowed to access, be it medication. If you are in a place where you are not going to be able to access anything, make sure that you have created a plan when it comes to obtaining medication, if that's a route that you're going to take. People who have tried to obtain medication right now have found that it is less legally risky if they do that prior to becoming pregnant, because that way there is less of a way of tracking that back to them. One of the things that I used to say during the first go around of the handbook was that I believe personally that medication abortion should be something that every person has in their medicine cabinet. It's very safe. It is fairly cheap to obtain. And that if you have a circle of trust with people that you can completely 100% be secure with, that it is good for somebody to have that on them, and then somebody else would know that you were a safe person to come to if they needed it. One of the biggest issues that we saw, especially during COVID, was that when people were trying to access aid access in order to obtain medication, it would get caught in customs. All sorts of things would happen that would delay the amount of time it took to get pills themselves. And because of that, having medication on hand beforehand is always a good idea for people who want to take that route. Doing that obviously is a huge legal risk in many, many states. And one of the things that I am bothered by is the fact that we are finding for most of the states in the country that the only access to medication abortion is through a site where all of the legal risk falls solely on the person who is obtaining the medication and not on where the medication is coming from. I find that disappointing because we're essentially putting the risk on the people who are already the most vulnerable. But also, this is a situation that we're in right now. I'm also very much pushing for people to try to fund red state abortion clinics right now. And I'm going to drop a link in here that explains why more succinctly than I will at this moment, because I don't have a ton of time. But the reality is that when we hit a post-Roe situation, there is no amount of money that we can throw at people that is going to be able to get certain people to clinics. People who are undocumented, people who simply have too many children to take care of at home, people who are disabled, people who are too young. There are always going to be people who are not, no matter how much money we throw at the issue, going to be able to logistically make it to a clinic. We need to be sure that if we are protecting marginalized communities, and we say that that is the most important aspect of what we do, that we do that in a way that allows them to be able to access an abortion both legally and medically safely at home as much as possible. And to do that, we need places for them to be able to follow up at. So I would love if people read the article that explains why. This is a portion of the movement that is being completely ignored, in my opinion, at this moment. We have focused a lot of our attention and our advocacy and our money on the idea of opening new clinics and safe spaces, but there are always going to be people who cannot get somewhere.
And the reality is that 90% of the counties in this country still do not have providers. So it's no matter how much money may be available to assist people, the travel, the time, as you pointed out, the number of hours can be just so prohibited, not to mention childcare, loss of work, and everything that is involved with that. What's very interesting is few people, there's so much talk about rights here. The criminalization is a topic that I always focus on. Robin just brought this up. Jessica's mentioned it. And what has cropped up now are assistance agencies. There's a group, Legal Services If, When, How, that is running a repro helpline, legal helpline. There's a repro Legal Defense Fund that you can look up on Zoom. There's a group called Plan C, which is advocating access for the pill and will provide all kinds of information. They will not provide the pill, but they will provide information so that the after effects, the type of bleeding that prompts people like the woman in Texas to go seek help are explained. Will we see, and there's always been national advocates for pregnant women, which have addressed the criminalization of pregnancy. Jessica, do you think that some of the advocacy, for example, at Center for Repro Rights, that's always focused on trying to lift the restrictions, may also begin to focus on defensive strategies?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of hard to predict what's going to happen in the future, right? And so I think we're certainly cognizant of and fearful of the risk that, whether they're aid organizations or providers or whatever, that there will begin to be prosecutions under various laws. Right. And, that's certainly something that we're thinking through and, and trying to plan for. But, that if we take like Texas as an example, there's been, a few lawsuits brought by a particular doctor who openly violated the law. But in terms of the people who have assisted individuals in getting out of state, there's been, no lawsuits brought against those individuals yet. And so, and if you think about it, there has been a whole sort of history of people traveling to different states to access abortion care that may or may not have been illegal within their home state. And, there's been an absence of any attempt to criminalize that behavior historically. And so I think we really need to, wait and see what happens and sort of how this carries out. And it's certainly something that the center is aware of and thinking about. And, I guess all I will say about it is that, we're not going away. So, we do plan to stand with providers and those on the ground. And so it's not a fight that we're going to give up if it doesn't rise.
I think that also there needs to be an acknowledgement for the fact that while groups like CRR can do everything in their power to make sure that a doctor is defended from any sort of jail time or something like that, the reality for many doctors, especially doctors who are in abortion hostile states, is that the bigger issue, like if you ask any abortion provider I know, hey, would you go to jail for performing an abortion? They would be like 100% because they believe in what they're doing. But if you say, would you be willing to risk your medical license for it? That's a completely different story, right? Because you're talking A, about their livelihood, B, their ability to continue providing care, and C, once you lose a license in one state, you're very likely to lose your license in all of the other states. And the amount of hostility that comes from medical boards in red states, it cannot be underestimated. When we opened the clinic took over the clinic in Alabama in it was May of 2020, and we brought in Dr. Leah Torres in August of 2020. Her first day was August 2nd, 2020, and on August 14th, 2020, I believe it was August 14th, we had somebody from the Board of Health come in and shut us down and say that her license had been immediately suspended as a danger to patients. And the issue was apparently that she had filled out something wrong on her license application. And so they thought that she had lied on her license application. And also somebody put in a complaint against her, a doctor she'd never met before, who said that he had heard her on a podcast stating that if you believe that your doctor it would impair the sort of care that you would get from your physician, you do not need to disclose that you had an abortion. And he said that that was medically unethical because doctors should always be privy to every piece of medical information that a patient has. And I cannot tell you how many patients we have seen in our clinic because they've been turned away by emergency rooms for suspected abortions. But it took her 8 months to get her license back through appeals, $150,000 in legal bills. And she almost lost her license in other states over it as well. That's the power that medical boards have.
I would like to open this up for questions in a moment. I know we're running up against the hour, but if people would stay a little longer and open it up for discussion, that would be wonderful. I just would like to throw this point out. We keep talking about the need for action. Fully agree. Marches in the streets don't do it. Those days have long passed. I personally believe that the storytelling and the time for desensitization about abortion has long passed. And there needs to be a strategy. Certainly there needs to be a political strategy, but there also needs to be a cohesiveness within the movement. And unfortunately, for decades, since the early 90s, there has not been a cohesiveness, nor a similarity of the same vernacular. I mean, there are still factions that use pro-choice when in fact, and justifiably so, women in reproductive justice movements say, you don't have choices if you have no options. So we're not on the same page with our language. We're not on the same page with our messaging. I don't know how we take action and unify if we cannot bring all the factions together. But I would like to throw that out to our audience, and take questions, comments from anybody. This is certainly the hot topic. It's a topic that many of us never thought would come decades ago. And where do we go from here? There anybody who has a question?
We were just that thorough.
Okay, well, we got to thank you. Then let me ask this. I can't help wondering if the old sanctuary movement of the late 80s, is there somebody who's trying to ask a question? Jen Rogers.
Where I am.
We see your hand, but your audio is muted. I'm sorry, we can't.
Can you come back?
We are having a difficult time. Let me throw this out. I started to say
Put
that
it in the chat.
I had covered the sanctuary movement in the late 80s. Is it possible legally, can churches and synagogues become sanctuaries for providers, for transporting people who need to seek medical care? Can the old clergy consultation service that was in effect during the 60s, rabbis, priests, ministers who were helping people through the Jane Underground, can something like that be resurrected with clergy having exemption because of the confidentiality of their position?
It's an idea. I can't. I don't know if the question is directed towards me, but I certainly don't know legally if it is. I do think that we've talked about this a little bit. I do think that religious organizations sort of stand in a unique place in terms of different arguments that are available to them that they can make. Now, that said, I think it's true that it's hard to know sort of how arguments under state RFRA laws or the like will work in this context. But I do think it's something to be considered, and certainly something to think about more.
Another thing that we can think about a little bit is the idea that the when you say sanctuary, it makes me think of the sanctuary cities for the unborn, which is how the Heartbeat Ban started, was through this group that was making all these little key ordinances in Texas that said basically that it's illegal to have abortions here, even though until they got to Collegeville or wherever, there were no abortion clinics. There is a definite place where people who are in red states, because clinics tend to be in more liberal cities, can try to work on things from a city perspective. For instance, working to pressure the city not to investigate any sort of poor pregnancy outcome, pressuring the police, that sort of thing, trying to work on city ordinances that say that you believe that all pregnancies should be a private thing. There's actually a piece of legislation that came out a long time ago that was a model bill from, I want to say 6 or someplace like that, that was called the Pregnant Women's Dignity Act. And it essentially just said that we believe that because marginalized communities have the least access to healthcare, because they are the most likely to have miscarriages, and so on, and because we believe that all people should have the right to have privacy in their pregnancy, we do not believe that it is okay to investigate poor pregnancy outcomes. And one of the reasons why I always liked this piece of legislation, and I was always angry that I could never get people to actually bring it up, is because if you look at Texas, Texas said repeatedly, we do not want to charge the person who is getting the abortion. They say that over and over and over again.
Right.
If you really believe that, put that in law. Pass this bill that says that no poor pregnancy outcomes will ever be investigated. And if they are refusing to vote on that bill, then that shows, okay, this is the hypocrisy. They actually do want to put people in jail, and you have them on record saying that. And if they actually pass it, then at least you have protections for that side of things, which at this point, any protection is better than nothing.
So one follow-up, I just did, and maybe I'm being the Debbie Downer now a little bit.
Don't bring me down.
is no, I mean, I think it's not exactly the same, but there have been instances where, you have district attorneys sort of coming out in various liberal cities saying, I'm not going to enforce the abortion laws. The one example that I am sure of that happened in is in Tennessee. And in response to sort of those statements of a district attorney saying, I'm not doing this, I'm not going to enforce these laws, Tennessee was then, in their very conservative legislature, was instigated to pass a law that basically said, if we have district attorneys who refuse to enforce the law, the AG can enforce the laws within those districts.
Yeah.
And so one thing to consider maybe with those things is, how do you strike that balance between not instigating a negative action, in response?
Yeah, and I believe Wisconsin just proposed something that says that if the state attorney general does not, if abortion, because Wisconsin has a pre-Roe ban that would go into effect if Roe is overturned, but they also have a Democratic governor, and so the AG said they would not enforce any of the laws, and they, I believe, are passing a bill that says that you can go back and retroactively charge people who provided abortions when they can manage to elect a Republican again, because they'll just always find a way to come up with new rules.
Somebody asked, how do we organize a movement? And there was another response in the chat that says, why are we not focusing on college campuses? Why is there no plan to go to campuses? There have been. I can say that a Fight for Her, Feminist Majority, Next Gen, All these groups have been on campuses, but it does not seem to be really a galvanizing issue. I don't know whether there's a feeling of entitlement among many young women who think, well, I'll always be able to have access, or that the reality has not sunk in yet. There's another question here, which is, let's see, somebody asked, am I mistaken in thinking none of these abortion laws include accountability for the men that impregnate women? Is this an establishment clause issue? Well, I can let Jessica answer that. No, we have gone around. In fact, we talked about this when we were suing as co-plaintiffs in our suit against the state of Arizona. It really is not. I mean, our lawyers have advised us, and we spoke with, a number of constitutional law experts. It does not, the bans do not prohibit our practice, our free exercise of religion. Even though Judaism, for example, does not recognize the unborn as a person, or recognize that, a fertilized egg certainly doesn't have a nefesh, a soul. The bans do not prohibit our practice of religion. So the expert advice from all the constitutional scholars is that there is no establishment clause issue. The only one that might have, a partial effect on that is, some of the burial clauses. I know there's disagreement over this, but, from Lawrence Tribe to Erwin Chemerinsky, Dean at Berkeley Law, and our CRR team and so on, there was a feeling that, and there is disagreement, that the religious argument would not be as effective as the undue burden clause.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly understand the sort of the emotional draw to those, arguments and to such a claim. I think it's just the case law under the Establishment Clause is really hard, right? I mean, the idea that life begins at conception, while I think many of us associate it with particular religions, it also, has non-religious, could have non-religious origins as well. And so that, I think, is also part of what defeats, an Establishment Clause claim, unfortunately. I'm not an expert in that, but so I don't want to speak, but I do know that the case law is really bad. Somebody else asked in the chat about sort of the corollary to the Establishment Clause under the First Amendment, which is free exercise. And the problem with free exercise claims under the First Amendment is that it was decided in a case basically that laws of general applicability don't violate the free exercise, even if they would violate one individual's particular religion. So abortion laws or abortion bans that apply to everybody across the board, they don't single out any particular religion in terms of restricting their exercise of religion. Now, I will say there was tremendous outcry after those Supreme Court decisions that sort of made that ruling, and that is what inspired the federal RFRA statute. And when that was sort of found to not apply to the states, the federal RFRA statute, that inspired RFRA statutes, states to pass their own RFRA statutes. And there are, different arguments that possibly could be made that are RFRA-like, but those have not, that's not really been fully thought out yet or tried anywhere.
There's another question. Could NCJW, other national organizations and city organizations work with the Center for Reproductive Rights on a campaign to sue all states when Roe falls at the same time? A coordinated effort might help get the cases or judges that are more on the liberal side. That's the question that was asked. A class action type of suit, maybe?
I'm not exactly sure that I understand the question, but I mean, the center, along with the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project, along with Planned Parenthood, you know, in all of the states that have passed, you know, these harmful laws, and other organizations, you know, they have been challenging these laws, you know, as soon as they passed, as fast as they can be challenged. And so it's not as though, and yes, if Roe is overturned in June, there's going to be a lot of lawsuits that need to be filed depending on how it happens right away. And certainly that will all happen sort of in relatively short order right around the same time, but we don't get to choose the judges that we are assigned in any of our cases. And a class action lawsuit is sort of among the states. That's not really, I can't really imagine right now how that would work or function, or if the class action mechanism is appropriate in that scenario. But there are very specific sort of rules that you need to meet to qualify for that.
Okay. And I'd like to go back to the previous question someone asked, which is, how do you start a movement? There's a comment coming in here from someone who says, you know, young people are not the problem, that we need to focus on getting the pro-choice candidates elected to the few swing states in our legislature, which would give us a majority. There's no question that we need to do that and need to get out the vote. But for all the reasons that Robin mentioned earlier, in terms of gerrymandering, in terms of the redistricting and the voter suppression bills that are out there, that makes it very difficult. You know, we have focused. Let's not forget that Emily's List was created to focus on getting candidates into positions. Every state, a number of states, I mean, we have Arizona List here, and they train candidates, they groom candidates, but we have not succeeded in getting the numbers. And I can't help think that some of that is because people do not pay attention down ballot. They vote for the top of the ballot, but they do not pay attention for their state, to the state positions, certainly not the legislative ones and the judges. So maybe that is the kind of movement and campaign that needs to be brought forth, which is making people aware that other positions on that ballot can have a significant impact on your constitutional rights.
I guess one thing that I would offer is, you know, I'm not a lobbyist. I don't do legislative policy, but I do think that there is something to be said for, if we think about the people who are most impacted by these laws, they are groups that have been traditionally marginalized in our societies, and thinking about sort of the intersectionality of these issues. And so abortion for many of these populations may not be the issue that's at the forefront of their mind. It may be putting food on the table. It may be making sure that they're living in this as safe a community as possible, keeping their children, their existing children safe. Any number of, you know, really difficult struggles that happen day to day. And I do think there's something to be said to sort of doing a better job of going directly to those communities that are most impacted and figuring out what are the issues that, you know, are important to you, and how do we focus on those issues, and how do we sort of focus on improving those issues. And I think that if, you know, sort of we sort of open those ears and sort of do the best to support those communities, to help them elevate their voices, it may be a way to sort of bring these issues to the fore in the ways that they're really being presented most presciently within those communities, to have the changes made that are going to bring the most impact to those communities as well.
I agree with that, but also, at least here in our state, those are the communities that are already voting for candidates who support abortion rights, because those are also the candidates who are supporting trying to keep the schools open and trying to make sure that the water isn't tainted and all of that. One thing that's really interesting about the Alabama legislature is that, of course, it's like 3/4 Republican and 1/4 Democrat in the state. But that all of the Republicans except for one are white, and all the Democrats except for one are Black. And so that shows like how, especially out here, the way that segregation works is it's not in a, you go to this school, you can't be at this counter sort of way. We use our public utilities basically are our means of creating segregation. It's why we don't have sidewalks out here. It's why only the public schools are Black and the private schools are white with a few Black kids that they'll let in. We use our infrastructure. There's no buses. They make our neighborhoods that are predominantly white in circles so that nobody has any reason to come through them because they're not through streets. It's looking at all these different ways that our communities stay apart from each other. I can say that the out here in Alabama, we can try and get more people out to the polls from Black communities, and that would help a ton, because obviously out here they don't have as many voting slots as, I'm sorry, I got late and now my brain's not working. They don't have as many polling areas for people to come to, and that's another form obviously of voter suppression. But when I look at the people who come into the clinic, the patients who come into the clinic do not think that they are people who have abortions. And that's the thing that is really difficult to try to figure out how to advocate around. And especially, like, we want to include the voices of the people who have had abortions in our campaign, but they don't, out here, people who have abortions don't think about abortion. They don't see themselves as people who had abortions. They see themselves as people. And this is the thing that they did, but abortion doesn't register in the same way. But I don't think that it's a storytelling project that'll fix it or anything like that. It's making people, it's making people understand that I don't know how to fix a movement. If I knew how to fix a movement, I probably wouldn't be down here in Alabama, quite frankly. I would be somewhere else, but I don't know how to engage. I think that we're trying to engage the wrong people when we talk about how we need to get more people to vote or more people to.
I think you are right, and we have someone in our audience here, from League of Women Voters who agrees there is a problem, a disconnect, looking for ways to engage. So anyone who is interested in helping to engage voters, the League of Women Voters is registering voters and offering training to help become active in the engagement process. So let's put that plug in there, absolutely. And we need to be out there educating, informing. I agree, we need to be on campuses and make people realize the vulnerability, because this is going to certainly crash in June. It is on its way now. And when we get that decision, we do need to take action. And the question that we leave everyone with is, let's figure out how to do that. So on that note, I thank all of you for attending. I'd like to thank our panelists who stayed up late on East Coast time for us, but offered such significant comments and insights. Jessica Sklarski and Robin Marty. Thank you. It's time. See, Jessica's lights are going off. So thank you again for participating, for being here with us, and We welcome everybody to join NCJW Arizona, to be part of our task forces, to help us with our reproductive health care advocacy, our immigration advocacy, our legislative advocacy, and help us make change happen. Good night, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.